The fact that the faces that we saw were overwhelmingly white male faces, and the images that are sort of now synonymous with those events, like Michael Chesney and his shirtless with wearing his horns and furs, and people in tactical gear and carrying the Confederate flag and so forth, just really struck me as sort of an exercise in hypermasculinity. So, what is toxic masculinity? Michael Kimmel, who is a noted theorist of masculinity, describes the American myth of the self made man, someone who is economically successful, who has economic security and emotional happiness from his submissive and adoring wife and children. So it really is the sort of 1950s myth that even if someone is working class and hasn't gone to college, that they can achieve material success and be the lords of their personal domain. Toxic masculinity occurs when this narrative collapses, as it has in so many corners of the country. Rather than blaming structural economic change, such as a globalizing economy, the development of a knowledge and service economy in the United States, and increased urbanization, these men who are overwhelmingly white and working class find themselves displaced from this self-made narrative, and they look for someone to blame. And so they believe that they tend to think that those that have displaced them from their positions of dominance, feminists, racial minorities, immigrants, the LGBTQ persons, are to blame for them losing their privileged position in society. So what do? They lash out, often in verbally and physically violent ways. Scholars have attributed toxic masculinity to a variety of social ills, including domestic violence, sexual assault, the involuntary celibate movement, mass shootings, and for our purposes, political extremism. I go on to argue that democracy in the United States has been gendered female for a couple of centuries. So before we had Uncle Sam as our sort of popular culture vision of the United States, we had Columbia, right? Who was at times European and at times indigenous to represent the North American continent, but she was always female. When you think about the Capitol itself, it is filled with metaphorical images of women, democracy, the Statue of Liberty, both in New York, but also Libertas, who's on the top of the Capitol building. Our common vision of justice, right? A blindfolded woman holding the scales of justice. They are gendered female. And even as we think about acts of patriotism, such as joining the military, what are we doing? We are protecting religious liberty. We are protecting freedom of speech. It's this notion that all of these things need protection. And that too is also a gendered concept. And then we look to Trump's personal narrative. And that personal narrative, be it true or not, is that he is the epitome of a self-made man. And what does his family look like? He has loyal and beautiful children who work for him in unquestioning loyalty, and a wife who is beautiful, who says little, if nothing at all, right? And so this leads people who embrace toxic masculinity to not only find that political extremism is very attractive as an ideology, but they also want to demonize people that run counter to their personal narrative. And that includes women who hold power, non-white males who embody power, and even white men that they seem cowardly and weak. So the very real death threats that were posited against Nancy Pelosi, as well as the attacks on her office, right? So there were two things going on. One is that the office was in a very prominent position, so it was easy to find physically in the Capitol, but they didn't walk by, right? They went inside. They broke mirrors, they stole a laptop. There's this iconic picture of the person from Arkansas with his feet on the desk. They left death threats and notes. The frightened staff members barricaded themselves into a conference room because they feared for their lives. But also Vice President Pence, right? You might think that the death threats against Pence run counter to this thesis. I would argue that it is actually highly consistent with this thesis. So in many respects, Vice President Pence is the demonstration of a healthy masculinity, right? He respects his wife and very clearly loves her, right? And he was very careful, as we've heard from my colleague, Mr. Kosar here, that he was very careful to think about what his constitutional duty was and to follow that as an act of conscience, but also as an act of patriotism. And how was he branded for this decision? He was branded as cowardly, right? He was branded as weak, right? Will he stand up? Will he be strong enough? And these were words that his own running mate, President Trump, used to characterize him. So in terms of those who embrace toxic masculinity and political extremism, the fact that a woman holds the office of speaker, and the speaker's office is full of symbols of not only American democracy, but the very power of office that she holds is a real extension of how toxic masculinity can explain exactly why her office in particular was targeted and sustained pretty terrible damage. But we have seen rhetorically and over time blowback against other women who hold power in Congress. Most notably the Squad, right? The four women of color, young women of color, who led by probably most prominently Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They are not only young and female, and very outspoken about their values, but they are young women of color who wholeheartedly embrace their otherness, right? Their very dress, whether it's Ilhan Omar, who wears a headscarf, or Ilana Presley, who wore a wig with braids and now goes bald to embrace her alopecia. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who talks about wanting to demonstrate her Latina heritage by wearing the bright red lipstick and her hoop earrings. They embrace their otherness. They celebrate their otherness. And this is in particular very threatening to people, especially white males of a certain socioeconomic background who embrace toxic masculinity.